particularly advertising agencies, have missed an extraordinary mistake that they're making. I don't know if you noticed this, right? If you call yourself a consultant, you can basically be employed to do anything, can't you? Okay, there's nothing really, you could be an anything consultant. In fact, consultancy is a word where you could pretty much insert any noun, concrete or abstract, before it. And it sounds perfectly credible, okay? So if you're a consultancy firm, people will come to you with practically every problem under the sun. If you call yourself an advertising agency, the only people who will knock on your door will be people with an advertising budget. And the strangest thing happened. About 25 years ago, I joined Ogilvy 30 years ago in 1988. Within 5 years, we no longer, as a creative agency, made any meaningful money from media commission. And yet, for the following 25 years, we went on behaving as though we were paid on media commission. So this is, broadly speaking, what the advertising industry does in June. It flies lots and lots of account men down to Cannes and goes, tell you what, if you're really nice to that client over there, he's got quite a large media budget, and he might spend 7 million on it with WPP instead of with Publicis. Now, if you're WPP or Publicis, that decision is, of course, important. In the wider scheme of things, it's like pissing in the Pacific. It doesn't make any difference. Because the weird thing the advertising agency and advertising industry completely failed to do, it completely failed to spot that when you were paid by the hour and not paid by commission, there were suddenly 100 times more problems that you could solve. Because you weren't confined only to talking to people who had a media budget. And for every person who's got a problem and a media budget, there are about 1,000 people who have a problem and no media budget. And yet the muscle memory of what we used to do was so strong, we've just continued doing it for 25 years. The importance of something is determined by how big a media budget is. Now, my contention is what that's done is it's caused the advertising industry two problems. It's completely failed to grow outside its natural homeland. What it really needs is a Columbus moment. It really needs to discover some new land. It needs to get budgets from people who aren't in marketing. It needs to get budgets from R&D. Because what I suddenly discovered when I discovered behavioral science is that all over the business world, all over the governmental world, all over the world of, say, environmental sustainability, there are thousands and thousands of problems to be tackled which can be tackled by anybody who's got that mixture of human insight and creative problem solving. And all those problems are being given to somebody else. They're being given to economists who immediately define the problem in economic terms. So conveniently then, only economists can solve them. They're being given to consultants who basically see everything as an efficiency optimization problem. They're being given to lawyers. And the crazy thing that seems to have happened to me is that we've lost an enormous amount of stature as well. If you think about it, when I first came into the industry, 2/3 of all ad spend was packaged goods. Now, that would have included back then cigarettes, it would have included beer, it would have included detergents, soaps, shampoos, and so forth. But it was packaged goods. By and large, within those organizations, media advertising was a highly strategic role, and it was decisive. Your advertising determined your distribution, it determined your facings, and it also determined consumer demand. So when you performed a large advertising act, you had a kind of triple whammy benefit. It solved 3 problems at once. What nobody else seems to have noticed, as well as not noticing the fact that we're no longer paid on media commission anymore, no one seems to have noticed that the fundamental nature of clients has changed. Now, the packaged goods industry, marketing was a very, very senior and very strategic discipline within it. Typically, if you're a large packaged goods company, the chief executive has done a 5-year stint in marketing. What happened is that now that 68, 69% that used to be spent on advertising by packaged goods companies is now under 25%. What's taken up the slack has been, in many cases, categories that didn't exist in 1988 when I came into the industry. So it would be insurance comparison websites, online retail, mobile phone handsets, mobile phone networks, broadband providers, cable television providers. Now, all those organizations don't have a marketing mindset at all. They have a highly financialized or technology-driven culture. And so the budgets may be the same, but the level of influence we have within them, if we only talk to the marketing function of those organizations, our level of influence is small. In many cases, of course, the relevant decisions may already have been made before they talk to us at all. And those are the two things we missed. We're no longer paid on commission anymore, and in some ways that's a pity. You know, the great thing about commission is occasionally you got a very large check for doing almost nothing at all. You know, that was nice. The disadvantage of commission is it confined you to solving only those problems for which bought media was an integral part of the solution. But the principal value of an ad agency isn't that it buys media, nor should it be. The principal value is that you can combine human insight and creativity to solve problems in completely strange and unexpected ways. But when you're dealing with a highly technological culture, or when you're dealing with a highly financialized culture, the dominant mental models those people employ are typically either efficiency optimization or economics, effectively. Has anybody here studied economics, by the way? Quite a few. Now, the interesting thing is, in order to make economics look mathematically neat, they make a series of assumptions. They create an imaginary world for which they're solving problems. And the assumptions are that everybody makes decisions in an atmosphere of perfect information and perfect trust. So they assume that everybody knows exactly what they want to buy, how much value they'll derive from buying it, how much they're prepared to pay for it, and they completely trust the person who's selling it to them. Now, in such a world, marketing wouldn't need to exist. So when you're working with an organization which has a financial, economic, or technological culture, essentially their mental model of advertising, which is external to their economic model, is that it's a necessary evil at best, and it's a cost to be minimized. It's not a source of value creation. And if you sometimes wonder why we're not treated as seriously as we'd like, it's because we see marketing and advertising as a way of genuinely making products more valuable. The people we're talking to see it as a necessary cost if they're to sell these products in which the value exclusively resides. That's why we often have a problem, because the fundamental culture, that's the third thing we missed, which is that the fundamental culture of the people we were talking to had changed. And I made an accidental discovery. If you talk about advertising, you get invited to advertising conferences. If you call what you do behavioral science, you get invited to number 10 Downing Street. And I suddenly realized that if marketing had reinvented itself a bit like consultants did, first of all, don't call yourself an advertising agency in a way, because the only people who will knock on your door are people who want to do advertising. I always look at the Ogilvy building and I see it a bit like a general hospital with the potential to solve all kinds of ailments and diseases. But we've kind of got this sign above the door which says cosmetic surgery. You know, if you want a butt lift for your brand, we'll happily do that, but don't expect anything more serious. And so the strange thing is I see an alignment with behavioral science as the bridge to escape the corner that we've unwittingly painted ourselves into. And if we're not careful, marketing no longer becomes a central business discipline and the source of enormous psychological value creation. It becomes reprographics with A-levels, essentially. And I think we risk that. And the great problem we have is that the vocabulary we use doesn't have a pet science. If you're in finance, you've got economics as a pet science. Every business discipline has a convenient pet science. We don't. So what you've got to remember is that the language of marketing is like the language of astrology. It's absolutely fine if you're talking to people who also believe in it, but to anybody else you sound mad. Okay. If you go to a finance director and you talk about brand iconography, okay, in a meeting with a finance director, that's like going to the head of thoracic surgery at Mumbai Central Hospital and saying, we should trust to the healing power of the crystal. Okay. That's what it sounds like. And my contention is that I see the huge value in behavioral science for what it is. It's a way of codifying and classifying the various aspects of human behavior that we know instinctively, but haven't really been able to explain. But I also see it as a way of engaging the wider business world and not being confined to going down to Cannes and obsessing over the 1% of the world's business population who happen to have a media budget. They shouldn't be our target anymore. All we're doing essentially is rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic if we do that. Yes, a bit of money might go from Publicis to WPP, and a bit of money might go back in the other direction. That's not the central problem. The central problem is understanding that value exists in the human mind and is created psychologically. It's created in the mind every bit as much as it's created in the factory. And until we can win that argument, everything else we do is secondary. What actually happened, I think, which made things worse, is if you go to, for example, Cannes, if you look at these enormous tech companies, now, a tech company like Facebook or a tech company like Google can't realistically claim to have a monopoly over all the world's good ideas. But it can claim to have a monopoly or a strong comparative advantage when it comes to reaching audiences. So either accidentally or on purpose, the tech companies have changed all the conversation in advertising away from content and messaging and towards the optimization of targeting, because it suits their ends to do so. If you think about it, if you want to sell a product, you sell a product on the things where it is uniquely strong. And so, patently, Google can't plausibly go into offices and say, we know about making films better than you do, we know about persuasion better than you do. What it can do is say, we've got a better audience than anybody else. And what they've done is 90% of the attention and investment in our industry seems to be focused on something which is the less important of two things. You know, good targeting merely finds customers. Good creative work actually creates them. That's the difference. And yet, the thing that has the biggest effect over the efficacy of any communication, which is what it says, has been forced to take second place to who you're talking to. Now, they're both equally important. They're both, I'd also argue, they're both at some level indistinguishable. They're inseparable. But the relative attention, I once made the point recently that for the money the typical client is now spending on their doomed-to-fail tech stack, you could have hired 10 David Abbotts for their entire working life. But what we've done is we've essentially, and strangely, the creative industry, in a kind of Stockholm syndrome, has gone along with this pretense. And it is a pretense. If you talk to people within those technological organizations, they'll admit the same thing. They'll say, to be absolutely honest, beyond a certain point, the thing that makes the most difference is the creative content. And yet all you people seem to want to talk about is the targeting question. You're optimizing the wrong thing. You're experimenting too much in one area and too little in another. And until we can change that, again, we'll be missing out. But as I said, the fundamental culture of business, I think, has changed significantly over the last few years. And a large part of business has become really a pretend science. It's the only way I can describe it. Now, economics attempts to model human behavior and value using effectively the tools of Newtonian physics. And the first rule of a science is no magic. You're not allowed magic in physics. You're not allowed magic in chemistry. But the vital thing is, there is magic in psychology. That's what magicians use. They use psychology to perform acts of magic. You can, by telling a little story, make something that's shit brilliant. And that's why I call the book Alchemy. You can't change lead into gold as a chemist. As a psychologist, if you want to make lead more valuable than gold, you can. And here's my example. We all know this. This wasn't an advertising case study. The media budget was zero, and the copywriter was the pilot of my EasyJet plane flying into London. So you know that business where the plane, you land at the destination airport, and the engines wind down, and you're still 1.5 miles from the airport terminal. And everybody on the plane has the same thought, oh shit, it's going to be a bus. And the bus drives up, and everybody gets grumpy and goes, oh, I hate these bloody buses. I feel cheated. I paid for an air bridge. Now they're giving me a bus. And I'd felt that for years and years and years. And then the pilot made this announcement. He said, I've got some bad news and some good news. By the way, a very effective persuasion technique. Has anybody noticed? It was only when I discovered behavioral science that I noticed how many good advertising end lines actually contain a contradiction. We're number 2, so we try harder. You either love it or you hate it. Reassuringly expensive. Fresh cream cakes, naughty but nice. Good things come to those who wait. They actually include an acknowledged negative. Unfortunately, Robert Cialdini, the author of Persuasion, has actually spotted this. And what the pilot said, he said, I've got some bad news and some good news. The bad news is I won't be able to get you an air bridge because there's a plane blocking our gate. But the good news is that the bus will take you all the way to passport control, so you won't have to walk far to get your bags. And I looked at my companion and said, hold on a second. That's always true, isn't it? But nobody told us. I was actually quite glad there was a bus. I had a heavy piece of hand luggage, and now I didn't have to walk past 25 Toblerone stands just to get to passport control. The bus took me straight there. Next time, if you want to practice alchemy on a plane, when there's a bus, just say very loudly to your companion, I'm really glad there's a bus, because it takes you all the way to passport control, and you don't have to walk so far. And what you've done is you've created gold out of base metal through a single sentence. And what I suddenly discover is this talent and this extraordinary magic you can perform that way has far wider applications. And yet, because of the weird way in which we call ourselves advertising agents, or whatever, we've confined it, the use of this extraordinary magic has been confined to an absolutely minuscule part of overall business and government problem solving. And I can prove this at the very end of my talk, if I have time, by saying that I am just some ad guy. I went into the Treasury and asked them a question about tax, which is, why do you do it this way, not that way? They never thought about it. Hundreds of people who spend their entire lives thinking about tax, they're paid to think about tax, had never thought of a different way of cutting taxation. And so very quickly, this is the guy, it's not Brian May of Queen, just in case you thought, it's actually Isaac Newton. Now in physics, there's no magic, okay? You know, simple, fairly straightforward equations capture all the meaningful variables, gravity, speed, mass, whatever it may be, and describe with unflinching accuracy what's going to happen. Generally, there's a single right answer. And generally, numbers capture all the information you need to know to solve the problem. So, for example, almost explicitly, physics says no magic. Second law of thermodynamics, energy cannot be created or destroyed. Now, the economists, in their attempt to copy physics, this is Milton Friedman, said there's no such thing as a free lunch. Now, there's no such thing as a free lunch in economics. There is such a thing as a free lunch in psychology, because we've all had loads of them, haven't we? Because let's face it, a lunch feels a lot different if you don't have to pay for it. Okay? So this was introducing the dismal restrictions of physical thinking and imposing it on how we actually interact with living organic humans. You can create a free lunch in psychology. But economics is so desperate to be consistent and look scientific that it's created a magic-free model of the world. And the problem is that once a solution gets to a logical person, it never escapes. Have you noticed this? Okay, this is my great point that I think pervades. This is why advertising agencies only solve 1% of the problems they could solve. It's because if you have a creative suggestion, quite rightly, I think, by the way, I don't think this is wrong. I don't want whole organizations desperately taken over by imaginative experimental people at every level, in every position. I'm flying back on British Airways at 2 o'clock this morning. I don't want to think that the people who check the wheel nuts on the plane or the people working in air traffic control are wildly creative people, just to be clear, okay? You know, I don't want the people checking the wheel nuts to go, let's try anti-clockwise this time just for the lols, right? I don't want that. I don't want the people in air traffic control to start experimenting with different configurations of landing while I'm in mid-flight. No, please don't do that. But equally, there's this fundamental bias in business where once you've defined something as a rational problem, you enact it, on the assumption that because there's a rational explanation, therefore it's the best course of action. If you're a creative person, all your work has to be presented to far more rational people than you for a cost-benefit analysis, a feasibility study, 5 rounds of market research. Anything that's counterintuitive has a burden of proof set against it, which is 20 times higher than the burden of proof for anything that's logical. Go into a company board meeting. This happened with KFC in South Africa. They had a product that wasn't selling. I said, put the price up. And they said, that's crazy. If something's not selling, you put the price down. I said, yeah, logically, but if you're wrong, putting the price down is a much more expensive mistake than putting the price up. Try it. They tried it, and weirdly, demand went up. Now, that's not that surprising, you see, because I think you go to KFC for, well, you go for KFC for one main reason, which is your wife isn't around to find out, in my experience. But you go to KFC for 2 reasons. You go for a bargain or you go for a treat. And something that's priced in the middle isn't a bargain and it isn't a treat. You know, it's like you don't get an endorphin rush from mid-market retail, do you? Okay? You get a thrill from a bargain and you get a thrill from an extravagance, but you don't get an emotional hit from mid-market retail. I went shopping for bed linen with my wife once, and after about an hour of staring at things, I said, can we make a deal here? She said, what? I said, can we spend one of 2 amounts of money in this bed linen shop? She said, what are those? I said, nothing or a lot. He said, well, that's crazy. I said, no, because I said, I'm pretty happy with the bed linen we got at the moment. If we spend £200 getting bed linen that's the same as our existing bed linen, I've wasted 200 quid on something I don't notice. If I spend nothing, I can go and buy a drone instead, okay? On the other hand, if we spend £500, I can get nerdily excited by thread counts, Egyptian cotton, mattress toppers, Oxford pillowcases, and I can actually derive a bit of a thrill from the experience. £200 is useless. I don't save any money, and I don't get any enjoyment. And so in the same way, you put the price up. Now, imagine how much more difficult it is in a board meeting. You've got 5 minutes in a board meeting, okay? Well, the product's not selling, so we're going to drop the price. Almost certainly that'll be approved in 2 seconds. If you said the product isn't selling, so we're going to run an advertising campaign and put the price up, people would argue that to death. So strangely, everything that's consistent with economic theory is more or less passed on the nod within business. Anything that's a bit oblique, a bit different, a bit value add, has to argue itself to death. And so we've created within business this weird world where the rational people are completely unpoliced. You don't get rational people going, well, according to my mathematical model, we should actually invest 3.5, but before I present this to the board, I'm going to show it to some really wacky people to see if they've got some alternative ideas. No, they go and present 3.5. Whereas if you've got any idea that deviates in the slightest way from conventional logic, you're put through the ringer. Now, let me just give you another idea, another example of alchemy. This time it was created in PR. Like the bus to the terminal, it was about 7 words. So, funnily enough, in a station, St Pancras in London, they spent about £500 million refurbishing it. Very similar architecturally, albeit smaller, to the Victoria terminus here in Mumbai. And the PR company that launched the fact that they'd now spent £500 million refurbishing the station included on every press release the completely wanky and irrelevant fact that the station now contained the longest champagne bar in Europe. Okay. Now, as a superlative, as a claim to fame, that's kind of crap, isn't it? You know, I occasionally boast that my grandparents were the 4th family in Wales to own a dishwasher. It's about that rubbish, okay? So nobody ever says, oh, I'm thinking of going to a champagne bar. Can you give me a list of possible candidates ordered in descending order of length? Or, you know, what was your champagne bar last night? Oh, it wasn't long enough. Okay? No, I mean, no one really cares about how long a champagne bar was. But for some reason, the longest champagne bar in Europe, if you go to anybody in London and say, where's the longest champagne bar in Europe, 14 years later, anybody aged 30 or over will go, oh, it's the one at St Pancras Station. And the magic of this was not that it was a relevant fact. It was that this single bonkers silly, silly fact basically conveyed to the human brain that this wasn't a boring transit terminal optimized for the efficient throughput of human travelers. It was actually a fun place and a destination in its own right. And those 7 words mean that now, 25 years later, if people want to meet in London, they might meet at St Pancras Station even if they don't need to catch a train. Okay? So those 7 words transformed, they contributed an extra £100 million to the value spent. Because you've got to remember, most humans, most ordinary people, consumers, don't know much about architecture. They're not going to go, I really like the new St Pancras, you must come with me and look at the architraves, okay? But Champagne Bar, that captures something. It just resonates. It's what I call, I'm going to use this phrase in a second, it's emotionally efficient, okay? Now, later on, a couple of years ago, they spent £1 billion renovating London Bridge Station. And they employed everybody, and they did a very good job, and beforehand it was the most hated station in London, now it's okay, but they didn't employ an alchemist. And I kept saying, all you've got to do is leave 2 retail branch shops, don't sell them to the highest bidder, which will be a fucking coffee shop anyway, okay? Okay? Sell them instead, make sure there's a guy there who's open 20 hours a day, and he operates London's biggest florist. So when you come down these escalators, there's a massive florist there. That's all you've got to do. And your £1 billion will have an emotional value commensurate with what you actually spent. Now, if you're wondering where I derive this from, Carnot Theory. Has anybody come across it? It's a really interesting and really useful concept, which is that in judging anything, we have kind of threshold attributes, we have performance attributes, in other words, how well does it do the job that officially it's supposed to do, and then we have excitement attributes. Now, Carnot Theory was developed by a Japanese academic for, I think, the consumer electronics industry in Japan. The classic manifestation of Carnot Theory, and I'm going to be a bit baffling to anybody under the age of 28 here, you'll remember it if anybody in the 1980s or 1990s bought a cassette player or DVD. Okay? Now, notionally, all you should care about is the quality of the sound reproduction, the build quality, and the price. Was it heck? The single most important thing when choosing a cassette player in the 1980s was the eject mechanism. You remember that? If you pressed the button and it went clack, that was manifestly an appalling cassette player, and you weren't going to give it house room. Whereas if it had a whirring, hissing motion with the hint of hydraulics, that was brilliant, and we bought that one. True of DVD players even later. And that's simply because what we care about and what something is are only peripherally related. And I think there should be Carnot Theory in everything. Now, why is that? If you think about it, Carnot Theory and the Dyson, the functional attributes are the fact that it does do a reasonably good job, baglessly, of removing filth from the carpet. The delight attribute is the fact that it's transparent, so you can see the dirt you're getting out of the carpet. Now, I'm willing to, I don't have a parallel universe to prove this point. I'm willing to bet that if James Dyson, when he designed his range of vacuum cleaners, if he'd done everything the same, but he'd made them translucent and beige, he wouldn't have sold more than 10. Okay? So what we have to recognize is that the human brain is a product of evolution. It isn't designed to accurately depict reality, because that's not what evolution cares about. Evolution only cares about survival. If, in evolutionary terms, you can sacrifice 20% of accuracy and gain 2% of extra reproductive or survival fitness, evolution will make that trade-off every time. So evolution is there to give us a picture of the world, not that will actually maximize accuracy and fidelity, but the one that will actually be most conducive to survival. And as a result, for example, we're hugely Carnot Theory here, for example, Uber. Okay, yes, the car arrives, yes, it's cheap, those are all functional attributes. There are 2 major bits of alchemy in Uber. The map, because we're happier waiting 15 minutes for a cab if we can see it approaching. Does anybody else do this, by the way? There's a bit of ego, which is you time your arrival onto the pavement to coincide exactly with the cab drawing up. Does anybody else do that? Because it makes you feel like Kaiser Soze and the usual suspects, you know, at the end, right? Okay? There's also a bit of psychological alchemy in that you can pay by credit card, because everything you buy on a credit card feels 14% cheaper than anything you buy with cash. And the fact that you don't request a paper receipt, you don't hand over any money, makes it kind of feel a bit like a service, not like a transaction. So as much as economists always talk about economies of scale, blah, 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 you know, cost efficiencies, the real magic of Uber. By the way, does anybody know where he had that idea? He had the idea watching the James Bond film Goldfinger. The Canadian partner of Travis was watching that scene in Goldfinger where Bond has a little map in the dashboard of his DB6, and he's following Goldfinger through the Alps with a moving dot. And this stoned Canadian one afternoon basically watched the film and said, that's how it should be when your cab arrives. Now, we're hugely over-optimized, by the way, to spot faces in things. That's immediately an elephant, that's George Washington, okay? Now, the reason is that in evolutionary terms, spotting things with 2 eyes and a nose is important. It might be something about to eat you, it might be something you can eat, it might be a fellow human being, in which case detecting whether that human is angry or friendly is the difference between life and death. But we see faces even when they're not there. We're heavily attuned to see faces. We even attach emotion. Here, for example, is pissed washing machine. And this famous example from Florida is, of course, the chicken church, a very surprised chicken. And depending on what we're attuned to perceive, I think you can create something called emotional efficiency. Now, the reason I want to use the phrase emotional efficiency is not because I believe it's the right phrase, but if you're an engineer, okay, if you're a finance guy, you like efficiency, don't you? Anything with efficiency attached to it is good, because that's the kind of sado you are, okay? So I'm saying let's rewrite marketing language and talk about emotional efficiency. Because the question is, in order to sell something, you have to first generate a certain emotion, because emotion, by and large, determines action. Therefore, the question in all salesmanship is what's the most effective way of generating that emotion? And it might be making the Hoover transparent. It might be having a really cool map when the thing arrives. It might be an advertising campaign. It might be telling you that the bus takes you all the way to the passport control so you don't have to walk fast. But all those things, or, for example, putting the longest champagne bar in Europe in a station and telling people about it, all those things are alchemy because they're magically emotionally efficient. They generate a huge emotional kind of volte-face in the recipient at a very, very low cost. Cartoonist, in this case Picasso, that's extraordinary emotional efficiency with a single line. Now, AI probably wouldn't pick that up as a dog, but we're heavily attuned to picking up living things. We're over kind of calibrated to detect living things. So the fact that without lifting his pen, you know, Picasso can basically go penguin and, you know, a slightly morose accent. That's kind of, great art is emotionally efficient. The television is emotionally efficient. Does anybody know this? Okay, now first of all, television manufacturers, when you bought your last TV, it didn't say on the box, optimized for higher primates, okay? Now the reason it didn't bother to say that is because dogs don't buy televisions. If dogs did buy televisions, they'd be really pissed off with human televisions, because to a dog, your television is shit. And the reason is that televisions only produce 3 colors. They claim to produce 1 billion colors, okay? No, they produce 3, okay? The other 999,999,997 are produced in your head. Why? Now, first of all, televisions don't bother to produce ultraviolet or infrared, because humans can't detect them. That would be a total waste of effort. Ultraviolet would impress a parrot or a pigeon. Infrared would be nice if you were a snake. Okay, right? Snakes always find TV, I think, a bit washed out and lifeless because there's no infrared, okay? But they optimize this around humans, and we only have 3 types of cone in our eye, and they detect blue, green, red. And that's the only 3 colors the TV needs to produce. If you wanted to produce an objectively accurate television, it would cost billions of pounds and be the size of a football pitch, okay? Be like one of those things Kim Jong-un does, you know, where every pixel's a yard across, right? That wouldn't be great. The TV is fantastically emotionally efficient because it simply says, I need to trigger this response. What's the most effective way of doing it? I'm not going to bother producing ultraviolet. I'm just going to produce the 3 colors that the human eye cares about. And what the human eye does is, now, you could have a TV that had yellow pixels. You know this, by the way, color mixing is entirely psychological. It doesn't exist in physics, okay? If you mix red and green pixels in physics, you don't get yellow pixels. You get red and green pixels, okay? What happens is if you fire equal amounts of red and green at the human eye, it can't tell the difference between that and yellow. So your brain goes, I better make it yellow. So the yellow is produced in your head. Magenta is even weirder because halfway between red and blue should be green. But your brain can detect green. And when you see anything that's magenta, your brain goes, that's weird. It's halfway between red and blue, so it should be kind of green, but I can't see any green. So it invents a completely new color, magenta, which doesn't exist in physics, to explain away the absence of green. Okay? So basically all this stuff is designed around perception, not designed around reality. The Parthenon's the same. So if you take the Parthenon, okay, the pillars aren't parallel, they bulge in the middle. The floor bulges upwards in the center. The sides curve outwards. And the decorative friezes aren't symmetrical. They're 4,000 miles away in the British Museum, but that's a separate matter, okay? But the point about that is the Greeks didn't design the temple to be rectangular. They designed it to look rectangular. And strangely, pillars that bulge outwards in the middle look straighter than pillars that are straight. Rolls-Royce borrowed this for the radiator grille. If you look at the individual grills on a Rolls-Royce radiator, it's called entasis, and they're slightly fatter in the middle than they are at the ends because it looks better that way. And all I'm suggesting is we should design things around perception, not reality, because perception's all we care about. And yet, the world's in the grip of these weird economists who are trying to design things to be optimally good in reality, not optimally good in perception. Nature, by the way, has hacked this trick very early. That's a chili. I don't really need to tell you here, do I? Okay, right? I agree with you, I'm a Brit. It's the essential ingredient of basically all food. I'm completely with you here. Okay, now the interesting thing about the chili is it's not hot. Every single person in the world would describe it as hot, just as every single person in the world would describe mint as being cool. And yet, the actual temperature isn't there. What capsaicin does, it was evolved by the chili plant to trigger a sensor in the mammalian mouth, and I presumably rectum as well, judging by experience, okay, which is only triggered normally by a temperature over about 110 Fahrenheit. So the only reason you say chilies are hot is because it triggers a temperature sensor using a chemical, not a temperature. Okay? So it's like the television. It's effectively faking an emotional response by hacking our perceptual apparatus. The reason it does this, by the way, is it wants to be eaten by birds which don't have this same sensor. Because birds don't crunch the seeds down, so the seeds will germinate, and birds also tend to take the seeds further away. So it's an evolutionary hack to make sure your seeds are eaten by birds, not by mammals. Presumably to parrots, these things could taste like strawberries, for all we know. They don't taste remotely hot. So parrots are really, really manly. They can eat tons and tons of chilies while manifesting absolutely no effects at all. Now, it's worth saying, before I slag economists off completely, it's worth saying that there was a school of economics which got all this right. The Austrian school, if you're familiar with people like Ludwig von Mises, Schumpeter, Hayek, and so forth, the Austrian school believed that economics should be a subordinate discipline of psychology. They were kicking around in Vienna at the time of Freud. And the Austrian school effectively believed that advertising and marketing were as much a source of value creation as manufacturing was. Because the value of something was not determined in the mind by what it was, but by the way it was perceived. And therefore, if you changed the context of something, you changed its value, even if the thing itself didn't change. And Ludwig von Mises here in Nationalökonomie, Theorie des Handels und Wirtschaften, effectively, when he mentions the man who sweeps the floor, he explicitly means advertising and marketing. He says so. You could produce Michelin-starred food in a restaurant that smells slightly of sewage, and nobody would enjoy the meal. If one of the spikes on your fork was slightly out of alignment, you wouldn't enjoy the meal, okay? Now, if your food isn't popular, if it isn't selling, yep, you could try and make the food even better. That's a waste of time. No, get rid of the smell. And all too often, what happens in businesses is when they have a product that fails, they try and change the product itself, not the context in which it's presented. And all of human perception is context dependent. There's a wonderful psychological experiment which I can demonstrate in a single slide. None of you, I think, read that first two words as Tai Chut. Now, actually, the H and the A are exactly the same symbol there. But your brain immediately goes, in that context, that one's an H, that one's an A. And similarly, you don't really notice that that's a B and that's a 13, although they're actually indistinguishable. What our brain does is it makes sense of something, because in evolutionary terms, what matters is not what something is, it's what it means. And so our whole perception is optimized around meaning, not around matter. Now, if you want a perfect example of this, I want to make the point, we should never ever talk about marketing as adding value. Because when you say marketing adds value, it gives the impression that the value itself is already inherent in the product, and that marketers just add a little bit of magic pixie dust to make that product value a bit better than it was before, okay? Now, the reason that's wrong is it makes marketing sound like an optional extra. You can have the best product in the world, but if you market it badly, no one wants it. Now, I always wanted to prove this by taking a really, really good product and marketing it really badly. I think there is one case, the Philips Airfryer, by the way. Does anybody own one? Yeah, one of the best things. Do you agree? It's a miracle, yeah. But they called it a fryer when it isn't, okay? So the kind of people who would want to fry food, and by the way, if you go to a store, it's placed next to the deep fat fryers. So it's an incredibly healthy way of producing fried food, but because you call it a fryer, and a friend of mine, middle-class English people go, well, we don't really eat fried food, do we, dear, you see? Now, a friend of mine suggested if they just named it in French and called it the air sauteurs, they would have rocked off the shelves, you see? But they called it fryer, and it immediately stigmatized it. Does anybody remember that French cooking technique called sous vide? Right. As far as I can remember, you put your food in a shopping bag, stuffed it down your underpants, and walked around for a few hours on a hot day. It sounded to me like the most disgusting way of cooking food imaginable, but because it was called sous vide, everybody imagined it was immensely sophisticated. So the Philips air fryer is one example of a great product which, had you named it differently, what's very interesting, by the way, is it's hugely popular in Southeast Asia, where, of course, frying and cooking are the same thing. You see? Where basically you don't have an oven. So because frying is cooking, in Southeast Asia, the things walk off the shelves. In Britain, you can barely offload them, despite the fact they're a life-transforming product. I mean, I bought one for my dad, and he became a kind of weird evangelist. He's 88, going around all his friends saying, you've got to buy one of these. So on the Welsh borders, there's this small, tiny pocket of air fryer ownership. You'll find. But just to prove it even better, two Melbourne comedians literally got one of the best entertainment products in the world, and they deliberately marketed him really, really badly. So Ed Sheeran, who at the time of this experiment was probably the hottest ticket in the kind of international or Western music industry, weirdly spent a morning hanging out with these two Melbourne comedians, and this is what they did.
Hello.
Hi. Whee! Peep shows. They have a pretty bad name, normally associated with lewd content, but by definition, they don't have to be.
So in an attempt to change that, we took one of the world's biggest performing artists, kept all his clothes on, and set up an Ed Sheeran peep show. Would anyone dare to believe what was written outside and come into our very dodgy looking venue?
How are you feeling? I don't really know what's going on, to be honest.
That was fair enough, because we dressed Hamish as a fairly shady-looking spruiker in charge of getting customers.
I got you Sheeran. Who wants some Sheeran?
All right, I can hear Hamish.
Do you think we'll get anyone?
I don't think we'll get anyone. It's going to be a brave soul.
I wouldn't come into, if there was a dude with a beard with a hat saying, like, come in and see this.
Ed was right. This was going to be tough.
You want to peep at Ed Sheeran for $2? Insurance. Do you want to peep at Ed Sheeran? Your loss. What do you reckon, big fella? Got Ed Sheeran in here. Beautiful ginger head man, sitting on a stool. What do you reckon? $2. Got Ed Sheeran just sitting on a stool in there. You want him? $2. $2 for a peep. Think about it. It's actually pretty good value.
Despite trying, we'd had a total lack of interest for over 50 minutes. It's been some time. We should have got you a more comfy chair, I think.
Yeah, I'm all right. I'm all right.
Hey, big fella, got all the Sheeran you need in there, $2.
What is it?
All the Ed Sheeran you need.
All the what?
Ed Sheeran.
Oh, I don't know what that is.
He's a singer. Yeah? Is that a yes? No? I think one of the big problems is people think Ed Sheeran's a code word for a new drug. How's it going? You guys like Ed Sheeran? $2. $2 for a 30-second peep. No, mate.
What, like, are they just saying no?
Yeah.
Categorically.
Dirt sheet peep. Dirt sheet peep. Here we go, $2.
Do you reckon we're pricing it too high, and that's why we're not getting people coming in?
I think $2 is pretty fair.
Here we go, boys. It's a Friday. Get you Ed Sheeran peep show. $2. Sitting on a stool, play you a song.
If someone actually does think it's a peep show, and I quickly give you the go-ahead to take off all your clothes, are you willing to do that?
I've been drinking a lot of beer recently.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
You're not?
A couple of months ago, maybe, but
Yep.
yeah, I'm in shape. It's just the shape of a potato.
2 hours in, and Hamish was getting more desperate.
Ed Sheeran is literally sitting in there on the stage waiting for your $2.
We were feeling it as well, but just when we thought this had been a giant waste of everyone's time.
You guys like Ed Sheeran?
I love him.
You love Ed Sheeran? $2? Peep show. Just got him sitting on stage in there.
Nah, you're lying.
Oh, $2.
Are you
It's
for real?
gonna cost you $2. You only get 30 seconds though. You wanna come in?
I don't believe you.
Well, there's only one way to find out.
We might be on here.
Here we go. Ed Sheeran peep show. He's there till midday. All right, your choice.
No, she did the smart thing and walked away.
Listen, if you guys want, I'm just saying, if you guys want to have a go, he's sitting in there by himself. It'll probably get busy later on. $2, 30 seconds. I mean, you both can come if you want. Just $2 a head. Everything's above board, I can assure you.
I'm not gonna get
Nah, absolutely not. Like, I can't guarantee what Ed will do, but yeah, let's pay you $2.
And after 2 hours and 23 minutes, including some final hesitation, we finally found people brave enough to take a peek.
Did you guys go to peep shows a lot, or?
No, there's gonna be some kind of
There you go, man. Keep your clothes on, stay on the seat, behave yourselves.
No.
Just listen to the announcement. Have a good one. Enjoy your peep.
Hello, welcome to the Peep Show. Your time will start in 5 seconds.
I'm actually a bit scared. Oh, it's...
Darling, I will be loving you till we're 70. Baby, my heart can still fall as hard at 23. And I'm thinking about how people fall in love.
Your time is finished. Thank you very much for peeping.
All right, guys, there you go. Did you have fun? There you go. Yeah, there you go. A little bit of it. Have a good one.
Oh my God, I love you.
Take it easy.
Finally, a success.
Now, what's interesting about that, I think there are a few. I mean, if you think that's comedic, pretty much anybody in the financial services industry is in the same position. It doesn't matter how good your product is, if nobody really trusts you, they're not coming in. You know, so actually, I think this is actually a more common problem than we ever realized. And two interesting things. When they finally get that couple to go in, they use a few behavioral science techniques. He's only there till midday. It's going to get pretty busy later on. You both can come if you like. You know, they're very, very clever. Scarcity bias. All low-cost airlines use him. Only 4 seats left at this price. You know, I've been studying scarcity bias for 15 years. It still works on me. You know, I go, oh, look, they're trying to exploit my scarcity bias. Oh, shit, I better book. Okay. The second interesting thing when you think about it is if you just placed one ad for that in the Melbourne Age and charged $100, you would have had queues stretching around the block. That's how advertising often adds to believability. You know, you must be serious about this because you're actually spending money promoting it. I can also trust it because you've said it in a public place. And information that goes to many people simultaneously is inherently more trustworthy than information that only goes to one person at a time. That's why we get married in public, okay? Well, in the case of India, with 9,000 guests. There was a headline actually in the New York Times for the wedding of Meghan Markle and Prince Harry, which said, "How do you cater a wedding for 600 people?" And the first comment underneath was from an Indian, which said, "Just contact your normal caterer and tell them to halve the food." But in the case here, I think it's absolutely fascinating because what we have here is a case where if the proposition doesn't make sense, for example, if you have a great product, it makes sense that you advertise it, doesn't it? It makes sense that you make a lot of noise about it. So if you have a great product and don't make a lot of noise about it, people are confused because they're going, "I would have thought that was a really big deal," but they don't seem to be making much of it. If something doesn't make sense, now this is where economics and marketing really need to differ. Okay. Now, if you imagine a case where you had two products, one product is ostensibly better than the other. It's a bigger television. Okay, but it's cheaper than the other television. Now, to an economist, that's the easiest decision in the world. Higher utility, lower price, you choose the bigger, cheaper TV. To the human brain, we don't work like that because we haven't evolved in a completely trustworthy setting. So we think, that's weird. If that TV really were better, the guy selling it would charge more for it. So there must be something crap about this TV, which I don't know about, because otherwise, why is it so cheap? If you think about it, okay, economists assume we operate in a world of complete trust. Anybody who'd evolved in the ancestral environment to be completely trusting would have been killed within about 6 minutes. The chance that they'd ever get, come over here and look at this wonderful thing, wham, right? We've patently evolved to be a bit suspicious. Now, here's a wonderful case where something doesn't make sense. Nespresso, I did contact them immediately, has 4 types of Nespresso machine in the Virtuo range. If I get this right, this is the Virtuo, and this is the Virtuo Plus with an automatic top opener, and it priced them both at the same price. And I had to contact Nestle and say, "You are batshit crazy. No one can make a decision under those conditions. If you make the other one £5 more, people go, oh, I get it. So kind of rich people who like a bit of novelty pay an extra £5 to have the lid open automatically. Right, that makes sense. Yeah, I don't really want that. I'll just buy the Virtua and save myself a £5. Or if you're like me, you go, ooh, it opens automatically. I will pay any price. But it doesn't really matter. That makes sense, okay? If you have two things, the Virtuo and the Virtuo Plus, and they're both at the same price, and I talked to salesmen in shops, they said, no, everybody can't get their head around that, so they don't buy either of them. And that's what happens if you have two TVs. You know, the bigger TV costs less. In economic world, everybody buys the bigger TV at the lower price. In human world, people don't buy either of them because they can't make sense of the decision. And that's, again, another feature of our evolved perception, which differs from what you might call conventional logic. This is why you have to design for perception and meaning. You can't design for objective reality. Now, when you think about it, when we design chairs, we don't just get physicists involved. We don't just say of the chair, does this chair support the weight of a certain human? We actually go, is it comfortable? Does it fit the size of the evolved human bum? Okay? If you notice, door handles tend to be at kind of the right height, because humans happen to be kind of that tall. Okay? But weirdly, when we design something like a tax program or an economic program, or we attach price, we don't think of the evolved human brain. We treat the evolved human brain as if it's some kind of weird mystical cube, you know, with no irregularities. And so one thing about perception, for example, is we perceive things relatively much more acutely than we perceive things absolutely. So if you think about it, it's much more important that we detect a contrast in color than we can name colors. Okay? I'm a man anyway, so I can only name about 6 colors. My wife can name 206 with things like taupe, which I've never understood. Do you have the same dispute? I'm a bit like a very early version of Microsoft Windows. I've got a color, you know, I've got about 11 colors I can name. And my wife says, no, it's not blue, it's a kind of bluey green, completely lost on me, okay? But nonetheless, okay, it's much more valuable in evolutionary terms to detect contrast than to be able to name colors individually. Because it's not very useful being able to point at a tiger and say, ooh, look, it's Pantone, whatever it is, whereas spotting the tiger in the first place is really important. And so if you take your hand and cover the join between the white bit and the gray bit, and so you hold your hand up so you can't see the join, what you'll actually see is a weird transformation where you realize that this bit, objectively, is the same color as the top bit. That's just one aspect of human perception that's kind of weird. Now, I'm coming on to this soon, which is our perception of price is also a bit like that. It's relative, not absolute. Our perception, by the way, we think we can separate what we taste from what we hear, from what we smell, from what we feel, from what we see. We can't. Before we even get access to information imparted by our senses, a kind of black box in our head, a sense-making apparatus, combines the information together to maximize cohesion in the information we're supplied. So painkillers are more effective if they're branded. They're more effective if they're red. Wine tastes better if you pour it from a heavier bottle. Your car drives better after you've had it cleaned. Have you noticed that? It's not just a cleaner car, it's a quieter car, it accelerates better, it corners better. It's altogether a better car. That's why everybody who sells their car cleans the car. That's why everybody who sells a house actually puts coffee on the stove. Because when there's a smell of fresh brewed coffee, it's not just a nicer smelling house, it's a better house. Now, if you don't believe what I'm saying about what you might call the leakiness of our senses, try this baby.
At any one moment, we are being bombarded by sensory information. Our brains do a remarkable job of making sense of it all. It seems easy enough to separate the sounds we hear from the sights we see. But there is one illusion that reveals this isn't always the case.
Ba, ba, ba.
Have a look at this. What do you hear?
Ba, ba, ba. Ba, ba, ba.
But look what happens when we change the picture.
Ba, ba, ba. Ba, ba, ba. Ba.
And yet, the sound hasn't changed. In every clip, you are only ever hearing bar with a B.
Ba, ba, ba.
It's an illusion known as the Mcgurk Effect.
Ba.
Take another look.
Ba.
Concentrate first on the right of the screen.
Ba.
Now to the left of the screen.
Ba.
The illusion occurs because what you are seeing clashes with what you are hearing.
Ba.
In the illusion, what we see overrides what we hear. So the mouth movements we see as we look at a face can actually influence what we believe we're hearing. If we close our eyes, we actually hear the sound as it is. If we open our eyes, we actually see how the mouth movements can influence what we're hearing.
Oh, sorry, that's that black box at work. Because essentially, it goes, that's strange, I've got a conflict between what I'm hearing and what I'm seeing. So to resolve this conflict, I'm going to assume it's more likely I've misheard than I've misseen. So I'm going to overwrite the B with an F. We don't have any choice in the matter. We're not even aware of the process taking place. And by the way, painkillers are more effective if they're branded, and they're more effective if they're expensive. So essentially, we have this black box which makes sense of various inputs and fuses them into a usable narrative. And we have no control over this. When I said our perception is highly relative, that includes the perception of price. If you look at an espresso, how many people have an espresso machine? I've got 3, would you believe it? I love it like a child, pathetically fond of the thing. Now, objectively, I know it is insanely expensive. If you had to buy an espresso coffee in a jar, like Maxwell House, or like Brew, see, bit of local knowledge, okay? For an equivalent dosage of caffeine, it would cost, I guess, about 5,000 rupees. And you'd look at it next to the sort of 300, 400, 500 rupee alternative jar, and you go, that price is insane. There's no way I can pay that amount of money for coffee. But the interesting thing is it doesn't come in a jar. It comes in a pod. And we don't really know what an individual filter coffee costs. So when we put the 39p or 50 rupee, is that about right for here? Pod into our machine, our frame of reference isn't Nescafe, it isn't Brew, it's Starbucks. We think, well, it's 49p, but I mean, at Starbucks, that would have cost me £2.20. So this machine is practically making me money. And in the same way, Rolls-Royce and Maserati stopped exhibiting their cars at car shows because a $400,000 car looks really expensive at a car show. Instead, they started exhibiting them at yacht and aircraft shows. Because if you've been looking at Learjets all afternoon, a $400,000 car is an impulse buy. It's like putting the chocolate next to the till. You know, the people on the way out go, oh, well, I didn't buy a plane today, so I'll have a couple of those. And that's why you should never buy anything at an airport, by the way. Airports do a wonderful job. You know, has anybody been to that bloody Sunglass Hut place? You know, where after you spent 20 minutes in Sunglass Hut, you know, if I were on the high street in the UK and there were a pair of sunglasses for £90, I go, oh, bloody ridiculous, they're taking the piss. Once I've spent 15 minutes in Sunglass Hut, if I discover anything in 2 figures, I go, ooh, a bargain. And the same thing applies to colour as applies to price. And since actually, genuinely, since what something is, remember the airport bus, is a product of what it is and the context in which we perceive it, something good can be made bad and something bad can be made good by changing the context. What that means, interestingly, is that sometimes, now remember, economics is modeled on physics. The opposite of a good idea is wrong, okay, in physics, because there's one right answer. That's why it appeals so much to business decision makers, because they like the lack of ambiguity. They can go to the board and go, according to our economic model, this should be 7.4, right? In marketing, in psychology, the opposite of a good idea can be another good idea. Because if you frame it differently, the things that are a weakness in one universe are a strength in a different mental universe, just by presenting it differently. And so what I always say is, one marketing technique is take something that makes sense, just pretend the opposite. Take the most successful product in the market and do the opposite of everything they do. Now, you're going to say, well, that's ridiculous. I can't imagine how that would work. Now, imagine, okay, you're in a meeting and you want to compete with Coca-Cola. And you say, look, for 100 years or so, Coke's been the most popular cold, non-alcoholic drink in the world, apart from water. We want a bit of that action. So you get all the rational people in, and I admit I would have said the same. And you go, well, what we basically need to do is we need a drink that tastes nicer than Coke, costs less than Coke, and comes in a really big can. So it's great value for money. And then we're going to beat Coke. No, you're not. What's the most successful attempt to compete with Coke in 50 years? It's that. It comes in a tiny can, it costs a fortune, and it tastes disgusting. Okay? They can run a Formula One team on this stuff. At one point, before they produced the variants, it was the most valuable single SKU in the world. Would you believe it? Why? I'm not entirely sure. It must be something to do with context, because if you think about it, if you promote a drink as being medicinal or psychoactive, different rules apply. We don't want medicine to taste nice, do we? Right? In order to be believably psychoactive, it's got to taste weird. If it tasted delicious, we wouldn't believe it gave us wings. And similarly, the fact that it's expensive means it must contain lots of potent, rare ingredients. And the fact that you have to put it in a small can says this stuff must be really powerful, because if they put it in a normal full-size can, people will go postal and like go doolally, right? So all of those things, the black box processes that and says, this is great. In the same way that it processes Coke and says this is great, because in a different context, different things matter. Diet Coke, by the way, or Coke Light as you call it here, I think, is that right? That's deliberately made to taste a little bit more bitter than ordinary Coke, because otherwise people don't believe it's a diet drink. If there isn't a bit of a trade-off, people go, that's not a plausible diet drink. And that importance of making something plausible has caused me occasionally in marketing meetings to do very strange things, including saying, the only problem I've got with your product is it might seem too good to be true. You know, and I genuinely mean that. I think that can be a problem. If you introduce a product that's too revolutionary, people are looking for the downside. If you notice, low-cost airlines made an awful lot of noise about what you didn't get. When low-cost airlines launched, they all went, you don't get a meal, you don't get a checked-in, you don't get a pre-allocated seat, you don't get any checked-in luggage, you've got to pay for this, you've got to pay for that. Why would you do that? Okay? Because if you say we're just as good as British Airways and half the price, people go, no, that's not true, I don't believe you. It probably means you don't service the engines and your pilots are all on day release from prison. Okay? But if you say, look, we don't put in all this fancy shit, but as a result you can get to, you can fly to Chennai for half the usual price, people go, I get it, that makes sense, right, I'll do that. I think sometimes in products we've actually got to build in failings. IKEA does it, doesn't it, right? Okay, if you think about IKEA, if you had furniture that cheap in the UK, we'd assume it was crap furniture. So IKEA makes you think, no, you're not compromising on the quality of the furniture, you're compromising on the quality of the retail experience. You know, I've got to walk 1.5 miles, you know, past kitchen, smorgasbord, slarty Bart fast, you know, £207.99 to find the thing I want. And then I've got to carry it to my car. You know, Americans couldn't cope with IKEA when it first opened because they're used to a higher level of service, and IKEA had to compromise a bit. But if you think about it, one thing you can't do, can anybody go to IKEA and leave empty-handed? You have to buy at least some tea lights, don't you? Because you couldn't bear the thought that you've been through that amount of pain and had nothing to show for it. And so I think there's something really interesting there, that the opposite of a good idea, if you recontextualize it, can be another good idea. There are two great ways to do hotel check-in. You know, facial recognition dispenses your key card as soon as you walk through the door. That'd be cool, because I then focus on how efficient it was, and I'd like it for that reason. Or if you turn up at, say, the Mandarin Oriental in Hong Kong, they walk you up to your room and make you a cup of tea while you're signing the bit of paper. Now that's really good, because it makes you feel like a rock star. They're both good, and they're both opposites. It entirely depends on the contextualizing of the thing. There is, would you believe it, it's no longer there, or rather it's still there, but it no longer practices the same thing. For 20 years, a restaurant called Wong Ki in Chinatown in London made an extremely successful business out of being the rudest restaurant in London. And it was its absolute pride. So if you asked for if you asked for a knife and fork, they'd ridicule you. They'd go, stinking Western pig, too incompetent to use chopsticks. When you arrive, they go and say, sit over there with them. Okay. Now, if you're a pissed English guy on a Saturday night, this was great. If you're an American tourist who'd wandered in from the street, that wasn't so good, because you weren't expecting it. And you hadn't got the context. But it actually became a hugely popular restaurant, because people would go, oh, sod it, let's go to Wong Ki and let them insult us. So anything can be good or bad, provided you frame it right. And that's kind of alchemy. I'm very interested. I'm interested in kind of veganism and vegetarianism as technologies. And there's this very interesting thing called Beyond Meat. It's a new kind of unicorn company in the United States. And it's kind of high-tech vegan meat. Now, nearly everybody would have used the standard iconography of vegetarian packaging in the UK and America, which is all about self-denial. Or altruism, you know, because you care, that sort of thing. Okay? Now, by calling it Beyond Meat and almost having an image of a kind of cow thing on the top, it's trying something completely different in the framing of a vegetarian or vegan food, which is, this is actually meatier than meat itself. Now, if you think about it, it's completely the opposite framing that most health food and most vegetarian food adopts, which is about the language of self-denial and sort of hair-shirted Puritanism. And what's so clever about this, I hope they've spotted it, is they've kind of done the opposite. And so what I want to say is very quickly is, there's maths and there's human maths. Now, let me give you an example, okay? In human maths, 1 minus 1 equals 0. In human maths, 1 minus 1, if you make people pay attention to the first one, is about 0.9. Okay? Do you see what I mean? Now, advertising comes from the Latin anima advertere, which is to direct attention to. And if you have a product with a strength and a weakness, and you direct attention to the strength, okay, people don't notice the weakness so much. So the equation comes out net positive. Because they focus on the good thing, the fact that this is, for example, a really comfortable train, and they don't focus on the bad thing, the fact that it takes 2 hours longer than flying. See what I mean? Nobody sitting on the Orient Express or on a luxury train service is there going, shit, this is so slow. Why can't they get a move on? Nobody on a cruise ship goes, why can't they make this bastard go faster? Why? Because you're not focused on that. Okay? What you pay attention to becomes what's important. By changing what people pay attention to, you change the relative importance, and that's how advertising creates value, because it gets you to pay attention to and therefore enjoy those areas where a product or brand has a comparative strength. Now, I said, what are we missing? Now, I think that the insights from behavioral science can be used to solve far, far wider problems than the problems that the advertising industry is given to solve. We are probably given about 1% of the problems we could solve to solve. And just an example, I said, I can solve train overcrowding psychologically, and I can do it using human maths. Two ways, right? If you're a train engineer, if you're a network manager on a rail company, you ask the question, how do we reduce train overcrowding? And you say, well, the only way we can do it is more trains, more frequent trains, longer trains, faster trains, and longer platforms and greater capacity, all of which is going to cost you hundreds of millions of dollars. And I said, why don't you try solving it psychologically? What do you mean? I said, well, your model of the world assumes that 10 times 1 equals 1 times 10, because maths models do. Human maths, 10 times 1 does not equal 1 times 10. Let me explain why, okay? 100 people who have to stand on the train 10% of the time aren't the same as 10 people who have to stand 100% of the time. In degree of pissed offness, okay, when I travel on the London Tube, I tend to travel at weird times of day. I have to stand up about 10% of the time. I'm not angry about that. Shit happens. You know, in any transport network, there are going to be moments of overcrowding. I regard that as totally unacceptable. If you're a season ticket holder and you never get a seat, you're livid, right? So I said, all you need to do is run 2 trains a day in each direction at peak times and make them exclusively for annual season ticket holders only. So if you've got an annual or quarterly season ticket, you can travel on these trains. If you haven't, you've got to buy a first-class ticket. Otherwise, you're not on the train. Why am I doing that? To make sure that whereas there may be 100 people who have to stand 10% of the time, there's nobody who has to stand 100% of the time. And my argument is, I think that solves the problem. I don't think it solves it from a systems perspective, but from a psychological perspective, which is the only one that matters. I mean, no one's dying because they're standing on the train. They're just pissed off. If you can stop them being pissed off, you've solved the problem. So stop worrying. And in the same way, I asked a separate question, which is, what if you could do that? Do you remember 1 minus 1 equals 0.9, right? At the moment, why do people not like standing on a train? Now, before you solve the overcrowding problem, why don't you ask the psychological problem? Now, okay, I'm not talking about 4-hour train journeys, okay, here, I'm being clear. I'm talking about commuter rail, half an hour. Why do people not like standing on a train? They can't hate it all that much all the time, because quite often, when seats become available, people who are standing don't sit down. Usually the people who don't sit down are the people who've found a nice place to lean. Have you noticed that? The people who are actually standing in the middle of the train carriage, they go and find a seat. But the people who've got a good lean, you know, they actually go, I'm quite happy leaning here, to be honest. Why don't we take this insight and go, what's going on here? Are people pissed off because when you have to stand in the middle of a train, you can't use your phone, you can't read a book, you can't read a newspaper? Why? Because you need one hand to hold on to something, because otherwise you'll fall over and get involved in a sexual harassment suit, okay? Right? So you have to hold on to something to stop yourself falling over. So once you've got one hand out of use, you effectively can't do anything enjoyable. Okay? Now, arguably, if you give someone a good place to lean, they regain the use of one hand. So standing becomes totally different. But equally, let's look at how trains are designed, okay? We design a train so that the bastard with the seat gets everything. Have you noticed that, okay? If you've got a seat on a train, you've got a seat. You sit down on the seat. You've got a table. You've got a view out of the window. You've got a place to put your laptop. You've got a place to put your coffee. You've got a place to put your bag under the table so you're not worried about anybody nicking it. And you've got a plug for your laptop. If you're standing, you get sod all, right? Now, if you reframe the choice so there's an upside and a downside to standing and sitting, the human brain will exaggerate the positive and minimize the negative. That's what brains do. It's called adaptive preference formation. So let's design a train where all the seats are in the middle. So you don't get a view and you don't get a table. You do get a good place to put your bag, okay? And you do get a nice place to sit, but you don't get a view. Along the outside of the train, we'll put loads of leaning points where you can lean, like that, view out of the window, table for your laptop, 2 USB ports to charge your phone, little hook to hang your bag. Now, standing is no longer a compromise, it's a choice. And you've completely reframed it so that someone who's standing can mentally tell themselves a story where they would have preferred to be standing anyway, because at least I get to use my laptop, not like those pathetic geriatrics sitting on the chairs. And so if you simply reframe the choice architecture of something, you can actually synthesize happiness for the greater number of passengers. That's again what I mean about alchemy. Like the bus to the airport terminal, you can create happiness out of nowhere with just a story. And so, very quickly, because I haven't got much time, a bit more human maths. Order matters, okay? The order of choice and the way we present a choice affects the choices people make. One thing that really worries me about the web is that generally everybody making a choice online is forced to choose by the same attributes in the same order. And that reduces the amount of information the seller gets from buyers. What used to be good about markets was that lots of people made a decision in lots of different ways. When you bought a house, some people saw the house with a for sale sign, some people went to a estate agent, some people might have searched online, and if they were advanced in the old days, some people might have actually seen it advertised in the newspaper. And lots of people discovered the existence of the house through lots of different ways. Now, all of those ways were individually silly, but collectively, the markets were intelligent because they absorbed lots and lots of information from people who were processing that information in different contexts. What's happened now with online real estate websites? Well, in the UK, at the upper end of the market, price bands go at £50,000 increments. Nobody can sell a house for £875,000 anymore. Because whether you're searching high-low or low-high, if you type in 850 to 900,000, the chances are you'll never get to the £875,000 house. So every house is priced somewhere close to a price threshold, which means you don't have a price-demand curve anymore, you have a price-demand ziggurat. And I worry about this. If you go to a railway site, it ranks trains by speed of journey. If you try and travel down to France, it always tells you to go via Paris if you want to get to Bordeaux from London on the train, because it's 20 minutes shorter or 30 minutes shorter. But the fact is, if you change at Lille, you don't have to travel from one Paris station to another in a taxi, okay, through the Diana Death Tunnel, right? You just get off at Lille, wait an hour and a half and have lunch, go to the Palais de la Bière, which serves a fantastic range of Flemish ales, neck back a couple of pints, walk back to where you got off the train and board another train down. Now, the second option is much better than the first, but the algorithm assumes the only thing you care about is end-to-end journey time, not journey quality. So we have to be really alert to this, which is how many times when we see everybody doing something do we assume everybody's doing that because that's what everybody wants to do? I always look at it and go, maybe everybody's doing it because that's what the choice architecture is forcing them to do. So I went to a pizza delivery company, Pizza Hut in the UK, and they said everybody orders their pizza. About 95% of people order a pizza as soon as possible. I said, well, that seems a bit weird to me because there must be people who'd prefer it a bit later. If it were 70%, 80%, I go, yeah, that makes sense. But 100%, 98%? Let's do an experiment. Now, why does this matter? The reason is, if you could get a certain percentage of people to order their pizzas 30, 40, 50, 60 minutes ahead of time, you could do batch processing. So you could put more than one delivery on one bike. The big obstacle, the biggest cost in pizza delivery is the delivery, not the pizza, just to ruin it for you. It's basically a motorcycle firm with an oven, okay, in economic terms. But the second thing that's really interesting is that you could then, instead of doing everything just in time, deliver pizza back to base, deliver pizza back to base, you could go out, do the 9:15 delivery, the 9:20 delivery, the 9:25 delivery, back to base. You've just made your delivery twice as efficient, half the price. You've reduced carbon emissions. I always add that if I'm talking to a left-wing audience, just to be clear. You've made a whole stack of money, and you've also solved the biggest problem of pizza delivery, which is the bottleneck on Friday and Saturday night. Because on Friday and Saturday night, the guys who ride the bikes would rather go to parties where the pizzas are delivered than deliver the pizzas. So you tend to have a manpower shortage at those peak times. So I said, let's try it. And I looked at the website, the default was ASAP. I looked at the app, the default was ASAP. I phoned up a pizza delivery place. Did they say, when would you like it? No. Unless you specifically go out of your way to stipulate deferred delivery, it fires the thing off straight away. Something, by the way, which email shouldn't do at the weekend. Does anybody else agree? If you send an email at the weekend, by default, it should arrive on Monday morning. Agree? Right? Okay, that's what I mean about defaults. You know, basically, there was a guy, by the way, I've got time, I'm slight digression. There was this guy who used to like fell walking, and he used to get up on Sunday morning, send emails to all his junior staff on Saturday morning, and then go fell walking, okay? He only learned 2 years later that he'd ruined all their weekends. He wasn't intending them to even look at the emails until Monday. He was just getting it off his desk. But they went, shit, I've got an email from the boss, it's Saturday morning, I better spend the whole weekend working on this. This guy unintentionally crapped up everybody's life. And that's the kind of thing that can happen with bad defaults in technology. I really, really worry about this. Because they're bad in the same way for everybody. So anyway, we said, okay, we'll try expressing it as a time of day, and we'll make the default 30, 40 minutes, or we might even express it as 8:30, 8:40, 8:50, 8:60. And when people ring up, we'll say, when would you like it? Is 9:30 okay, or would you like it a bit sooner? So we'll just change the social expectation. You could push the thing out as far as an hour without losing any sales. Secondly, you could put 3 pizzas on 1 bike rather than 1. Thirdly, and we didn't expect this for a second, customer satisfaction went up by 50%. And I don't know why. The best theory I have is that if you say as soon as possible, people are kind of on tenterhooks waiting for it to arrive. Whereas actually, if you say 8:30 and it arrives at 8:28, they go, that was really good. That actually, when you say as soon as possible, there's no way of actually surpassing expectation. But if you say 8:25 and you turn up at 8:23, they go, that was really cool. Fascinating. But everybody in the pizza industry assumed that it was all about speed. Actually, particularly if you have maps that show where the bike is, that assumption probably no longer holds. So anyway, an extra bit of human maths here. Here we go. 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2 is the same as 1 plus 3 plus 1 plus 3 plus 1 plus 3, okay? Not very controversial, okay? But 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 is a much bigger number than 1 times 3 times 1 times 3 times 1 times 3. Now, economics assumes that utility, okay, in the human brain is additive. And you get a bit of extra utility, you get a bit less utility. In evolutionary terms, over time, we think this assumption that what you might call human life is ergodic is a false assumption. Human fortune is multiplicative. You know, one act of massive misfortune, and it doesn't matter what happens to you in the future because you're dead, okay? So human life is highly time sensitive. Human life, therefore, we believe, has evolved to prefer not only higher averages, which we do prefer, but lower variance. Because 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 is much bigger than 1 times 3 times 1 times 3 times 1 times 3. Why does that matter? And I think it matters because actually, when you make a decision under uncertainty, instinctively you've got to consider 2 things. How good is the outcome likely to be on average? But also, what's the worst that can happen? Because it's no good making a decision that's really good on average if 1 time in 50 it's fatal, right? If 1 time in 50 it's disastrous, okay? Then actually that's not a good decision, because if you take decisions like that 50 times, you end up dead. Got it? If you think about it very simply in Russian roulette terms, okay, if I offer 1,000 people $1 million to play Russian roulette once, some of them might say yes. If I offer a load of people $1 billion to play Russian roulette 1,000 times, nobody's going to say yes, because you're dead, okay? Now, this, I think, explains brands. That simple bit of maths explains why consumers prefer brands. They don't see brands as a guarantee of superiority. They see them as a reliable proxy indicator of low variance. I've got an extraordinary napkin somewhere at home where Nassim Taleb and I, over dinner, drew the graph. And what we said about McDonald's is the most popular restaurant in the world, not because it's very, very good, but because it's incredibly good at not being terrible. Okay? So, you know, you wouldn't take someone there on a date. Okay, that's what Nando's is for, okay? But McDonald's if you want basically to know that you won't be ripped off, the food will be edible, the food will be palatable, you'll have a perfectly pleasant place to sit, you won't be abused by the waiter, you won't be ripped off, and you won't get ill, nothing beats McDonald's. It's low average, low variance. And when we make a decision, we care about both. And I would argue, by the way, human cooperation probably evolved around this. Two guys go out hunting, okay? And they go, okay, if you get 3 and I get 1, we split the difference. That simple decision, if I get 3, you get 3, we both keep 3. If we both get 1, we both keep 1. If I get 3 and you get 1, we'll make it 2 each. That simple act of exchange will make the organism more successful. And so I go as far as to say that I think that's what people pay for when they pay for a brand. I think they do it instinctively. I think when they look at products that don't have a name on them, that they don't recognize the name on, they don't say, I don't like this because he hasn't got enough reputational skin in the game and therefore I consider this a high variance purchase. I think they just feel a bit frightened buying things they've never heard of. Because reputational investment is a good proxy for quality control. You're only willing to invest up front in your reputation if you believe that your product will deliver it repeatedly over time. And that's what flowers do. It's what weddings are about, by the way. Upfront expense is proof of long-term intention. You have massively, right? If you think about it, an engagement ring has to cost a man an amount that hurts, okay? Because if he were planning a one-night stand, okay, he wouldn't be spending this amount of money on a ring. It proves that he has long-term intentions for the relationship, okay? That's why, of course, you have the most expensive weddings in the world, and you also have the lowest divorce rate in the world. You see, it's not a coincidence. You basically think, I'm not going through that again, okay? Flowers, okay? So this is a fascinating thing. This is how to think of marketing. It's the science of knowing what economists are wrong about. I mean, literally. Go and take any setting you have and say, what are the things that logical people would assume here? And which of them is a safe assumption and which of them can be challenged? That's more or less, I think, what a marketer, the marketing methodology should be. That in everything that's done, there's always, in every great success, I think there's always something that slightly defies conventional logic. It's the thing we notice, it's the thing we care about. If we had a sense of proportion, it wouldn't bother us how the eject mechanism worked, but the way we've evolved, it's the most important thing. And looking for those things first requires that you abandon the conventional assumptions of logic. And in order to produce magic, you've just got to let go of logic. And so looking at what a very imaginary logical person would do and saying, let's just take one of those assumptions and test if the opposite might be true. Don't do it all the time. Bees don't do it all the time. But do it some of the time. 20% of bees ignore the waggle dance. 80% of bees basically exploit what they already know about where you can find nectar. 20% of them go off on exploratory missions to try and find out what they don't yet know. That's roughly the ratio of activity that should go on in a business. 80% of it should be exploiting what makes sense, what we know it works, it's worked in the past, and 20% of it should be just continually testing and updating that knowledge to find out whether it's still true. Don't forget, things that were true 10 years ago can be completely untrue 10 years later, you know. Okay, Wi-Fi on a train wasn't a solution. You did care. When a train journey was really boring, you cared a lot more about how fast the train was. The invention of Wi-Fi suddenly changes that. You know, you cared about how fast your parcel arrived. Parcel tracking arguably means that so long as you know it's on its way, you're not particularly neurotic about it anymore. But that's always got to be the trade-off. If you try and optimize efficiency based purely on what you already know, bees don't do this. Because they modeled it as a complex system and realized that without the random bees, the hive would get trapped in a local maximum and starve to death. It's the random bees who are doing kind of R&D continually, testing the existing knowledge of the hive to see where it can be enhanced or challenged. Now, once you understand this, all I'd like to say, 2 slides to go. We should just start taking all the things that everybody assumes and occasionally go, what if you're wrong? Economists assume there's no difference between getting poorer and getting less richer because they see an expense as being equal whether it's a payment or a reduced pay rise. These guys transformed the design of pensions Thaler and Benazzi, he later got the Nobel Prize for Economics, by suggesting, no, the way you should make a pension work, think about it in terms of variance. Remember what I said about low variance? The way you make a pension work is you sign up for a pension at 25%. Doesn't cost you anything. Every pay rise you get over your life, 25% of the upside goes into your pension. You never get poorer, you get less richer. For evolutionary reasons, we much prefer that to signing up straight away to a pension that's going to cost us $300 a month. Okay? Psychologically, in terms of variance reduction, in terms of downside minimization, to an economist, they're identical. To a human being, they're totally different. And I asked the same question yesterday about tax. Why do you do tax cuts? They said, well, people like them. They go, yeah, they like them for about a year, but then you just get a new baseline and nobody notices them anymore. Don't do tax cuts. Keep the tax rate the same, and once a year, refund people a lump sum. Now they'll notice. Okay? Now, nobody, this is what I started off this evening, nobody in the whole tax field had ever questioned the logic of that. They'd never assumed that there might be a difference between simply reducing the amount of money you took away from people or taking away the same amount of money and giving it back. Because in economics, they're exactly the same. In psychology, they're totally different. Now, why would I like to do this? A, because people would notice. B, because before you paid someone their refund, you could encourage them to give half of it to charity. It's very hard to give £300 to charity. If you're suddenly given a £600 rebate and you're told, would you like to receive just 300 and the other 300 can go to charity, the mental equation is different. So, I think it's just an extraordinary point that there are whole areas. I started this talk talking about what are we missing. There are whole areas of human decision making which marketing thinking hasn't even touched. If we go into different worlds with what you might call a design mentality, a perception mentality, looking how to maximize emotional efficiency, as I called it earlier, there are enormous swathes of things which have been covered by economists, by management consultants, by rational people for years, and where marketing thinking hasn't even penetrated. If we move into those territories, we can genuinely change the world. Thank you very much indeed.